So what I'm gonna do is in the next 10 minutes is actually invite you into a conversation which really is only just beginning, and to try and, I guess, hopefully start a conversation about how in social work we can think about climate change as a moment in time where we can recalibrate the way that we actually locate ourselves and our work in a whole lot of different ways. And there's an absolute opportunity where we can actually think about all of the core, there's an opportunity for us to think about all the core ideas that are within social work, but actually recenter them in a different way and expand them in a different way as well. So I'm not going to talk to you about a specific research project. I'm going to do an ad for a book right at the end, but I want to actually just talk to you about some key ideas that are starting to actually gain momentum around how we think about climate change. And before I kind of go into it, I want to really make a differential. I want to kind of draw a difference between what I'm not talking about here is green social work. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is the global impact of climate change and how it can fundamentally recalibrate the way social work operates, not in a little kind of section that says we're in green social work, but actually at its foundations all the way through. So in terms of actually thinking through, why should we think about climate change? What's it got to do with us, really? You know, we're about people, we're about, you know, the disadvantages and the advantages that people experience. And I guess what we're actually seeing is that what climate change is doing is actually accentuating disadvantage. It's accentuating power differentials between people. It's happening right now, and it's actually going to continue to happen in a way that is actually not understood at this point, at a scale that is not understood at this point. We're starting to see it. We're starting to see it in the cascading impacts of disasters globally, and the ways and the uneven ways in which those disasters are impacting on particular communities, particular places, how they're actually impacting on some places and some people over and over and over again in this cascade, and whereas other people are relatively free from the really significant impacts. So I think what I guess the research that I've been involved in with a number of colleagues here at Sydney Uni and elsewhere, looking particularly at disasters, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's about how then do we actually design and recalibrate support for people in a socially just way that actually works in a world where we don't know what's going to happen next, where actually things are going to get so hot that people will start dying in their thousands, where floods are so extreme that they actually are wiping out whole towns. How do we actually you know, work on social justice in this world, which is actually going to become quite chaotic and quite uncertain? So what are we actually learning from disasters? In Australia, we've had a number of different cascading disasters that occurred across the kind of board. And the things that we're actually learning from those that are actually going to help us in social work and in rethinking about social work is that we're seeing what we're seeing in the impact of disasters up in the Northern Rivers, in the flooding and fire cascading disasters in the Hawkesbury, in the floods down in Victoria, and a whole other range of disasters overseas, is that we're seeing that people are actually acting together in ways that are fluid, are self-organising, and are dynamic, and are creating new ways, new kind of sort of fluid community organisations that provide people with support and provide people with connection, that actually really draws attention to the way in which formal services, and this happens over and over in disasters, formal services are increasingly unable to support people effectively. So when a disaster hits, there's a formalised system. It's very, very organised, it's very hierarchical, it's triggered by particular legislation, it's embedded in policy, and it's got a very, very planned way of actually unfolding. However, what actually happens in the disaster is that people on the ground have no experience of that whatsoever. Their experience is that they're left alone, often sitting on the roof of their house, thinking they're going to die. That's what the experience is over and over and over again, because there's an overpromise by the state, there's an overpromise by services, not because they don't have intention to help people or to support people, but because there are not enough resources to actually be able to assist people at the scale that they need to be able to assist people. And so what do people do? They self-organise. So what we're seeing in disasters and what we can learn in social work is that there are an enormous number of different self-organising kind of systems that actually emerge during a disaster and then continue after that disaster has actually finished. These are the kinds of self-organising kind of systems that actually will recalibrate a new support system for people, a different way of supporting people. Right now, those systems are not supported by the formal system. They're often left out. They're often seen in competition by the formal system. They're often seen as a problem. I've heard people in emergency services call them rogue systems. And, you know, we're all familiar with them. They're the people who get on their jet skis and go and rescue people, you know, because they're on the ground. They're there. I've spoken to people who, you know, rescued 30 horses and put their lives at risk because they had to do it. They were there. Nobody else was there. They had to do that kind of work. Up in Lismore, Resilient Lismore, just people came together and they actually formed a whole, in 24 hours, in 48 hours, they formed an entire welfare system based at the train station where they were feeding people, they were washing their clothes off, providing housing for people, they were doing a whole lot of different things. This actually it emerged from the disaster itself, but was actually operating outside or parallel to the formal system, and the formal system saw it as a threat and actually saw it as a problem. So what do we need to do in social work? In this, disasters actually teach us that we actually need to look to what is emerging. We need to look at what is changing, and we need to look at how we need to recalibrate how this relationship between the formalised system and the informal system, which at the moment is very problematic or non-existent, can actually become much more integrated. And it's tricky. It's one of the big, you know, challenges of the age, because formalised systems, we know they're stable, they're structured, they do those things really well. But what they don't do well is adapt, be flexible, and actually be able to respond to those kinds of disasters. But this is the world that we're living in climate change. So we need to, in our thinking in social work, we need to be this. So what are some of the ideas that that sort of are underpinning the thinking that we've been doing in our research with disasters, and then now we're sort of starting some research down in the Murray-Darling Basin around water futures and climate change? Firstly, what we actually need to think about is how do we recenter the person and environment idea around social work? It's a really fundamental idea in social work. How do we actually recenter that away from us to social justice being about justice for Earth and all who live here? This is a big change. It's not inconsistent with what we practice in social work, but it's actually a big change. We are not at the centre. If we actually look at justice for Earth and all who live here, it fundamentally changes the way we actually think about how social support might be designed and organised, and how we are located in systems, not just between people, but in a much broader environment than that. The next thing that we actually really has been very helpful in trying to make sense of disasters and climate change is thinking through complexity and complexity kind of theory. I noticed that Emma talked about complexity theory before, a bit, talked about emergent kind of ideas, and this is like gold for social work. We've been talking about this stuff for a very long time, and finally we've got a language that actually works and we can see in practice around not just systems theory in a small way, but complex systems theory. How do actually new things emerge all the time in surprising environments, which we're seeing all the time in climate change? How do we actually make sense of feedback loops? How do we actually look at all of the unpredictable things that are actually happening in the complex systems that we've already been working in? But when we look at climate change, there's a much bigger scale and much more intensity around those kinds of things. So it's non-linear, it's dynamic, it's emerging, things are actually happening all the time. This requires us to really expand our thinking and really start thinking about systems in a much bigger way than often we do in social work practice. Much more than human, much bigger than just person in environment in that limited way. The next thing I just want to, I know I've got 1 minute to go, but I just want to emphasise again, my research is very much around community development, working with communities. The thing about climate change is that there is no individual option here. There is absolutely no way of addressing climate change at any level as an individual and making a difference. This is the collective challenge of the age And it is this that will actually tell us that we need to be thinking collectively and working collectively, working together to actually make change together. And that means that as social workers, we actually need to be working with biologists and hydrologists and agricultural economists and other kind of scientific kind of disciplines, as well as all the other people that we work with as well in our usual kind of work. So again, we need to expand our horizons around that kind of stuff, and I'm nearly finished. So what do we actually do right here, right now? This is, as I say, this is a beginning conversation. We're still trying to make sense of it. It's big thinking, and it's actually a really challenging process, and all of us need to be part of it. I'd like to invite you to be part of it too, and would love to have another conversation with people. If you're more interested in this kind of stuff, we've got a book out with a whole lot of people: Margot Rawson, Pam Joseph, Maurice Terrer, Dara Sampson, and Megan Catrick Harris, and me. We put together a book based on our research and also on some thinking around this stuff. So if you're interested in that book, it's available. So, and I'd love to talk to you further. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. Okay, so we've got time for a couple of questions. Any questions on Zoom? No, all good. And we've got one up the back. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. That was amazing. I wanted to ask you more about, you kind of talked about how the state or the government saw community responses as a threat. I've heard I'm just interested in the way that we work with the government as social workers and with the state in this kind of stuff. I've heard another angle as well, which is particularly around the fires. I think a lot of people were talking about a lot of kind of big donation drives were run, and a big kind of lashback to that was stop donating to the fire service, because it's actually the government's responsibility to come up with a meaningful fire, system that responds to fires. And so we're using kind of private individuals and communities to kind of prop up what should be a government responsibility. So I'm interested in your response to that and what we do.
Well, yeah, that's a big one. We could probably talk for another 2 hours on that. But certainly in disaster world, there's this whole idea around shared responsibility. And what shared responsibility means in practice is that it's actually all on you. and actually the state says, no, it's your responsibility. You've got to be responsible for yourself. And I think the challenge in this is to really try and operationalize notions of community, to actually say, no, it's actually a collective responsibility. And we need to, at a policy level and at a practice level, be able to say, here's how we need to build much more deliberative structures within communities and within society, which enable a democratic process of making decisions together. I think what happens is that there's no decisions are very top down, and then at the bottom people are doing their own thing. So yeah, definitely there's massive work around changing the relationship between the state and people on the ground, and actually the state shifting to take those responsibilities, but not in the way it has now, which is in a very top-down, non-consultative kind of way. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, it's a big deal. It's a big question. Yep. So thank you.
And we have a question from Ruth.
Sorry, Amanda, but I'm going to ask you a bigger question.
Oh, right, yeah. How long have we got it? People want a glass of water and say, we had to talk about it over a glass.
I mean,
yeah.
because you did mention solidarity, and I guess one of the most vexing things for me is, how does solidarity emerge in this highly individualistic neoliberal world, and where it's turned down in politics across the country? And I guess it's deeply concerning, because I totally agree with you. We can only address climate change through global solidarity, not just small communities, but everyone working. So I wonder if you have noticed any political shifts towards solidarity in the communities that you've been working.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's what interestingly see, what's going in that book, and what we see is that there is definitely a shift towards the collective. But interestingly, in social work, the shift has been elsewhere. It's been in the opposite direction. I think we've got to bring it back away from that individual. Like you see globally, and you see in politics and the whole thing, there's a shift much back more towards the collective at all kind of levels. But meanwhile, we've been wandering off in this other direction. And I think really what climate change, I think, does in a horrible way, but it forces you back into that engagement with what does it mean to be collectively responsible and collectively supportive to each other, because there's no other option. And how do we actually, and I think that's the argument that we need to make at a policy level as well, to actually go, well, this is actually, this is not an option. We need to shift it back and actually articulate ways in which we can actually do policy and practice at a collective level, and really operationalize that in a way that's doable. So, but I think it's a massively important issue. But I think we're part of that pushback, and I think we need to be really involved in it at its, really pushing hard along with a whole lot of other people.